Marcus Chen, um jovem desenvolvedor de software em uma empresa de tecnologia em Seattle, é constantemente ignorado e subestimado por seus colegas devido à sua personalidade introvertida e aparência jovem. Trabalhando silenciosamente nos bastidores, ele desenvolve soluções inovadoras que passam despercebidas até que uma crise na empresa revela sua verdadeira importância. A história acompanha sua jornada de invisibilidade ao reconhecimento, explorando temas de preconceito no ambiente de trabalho, perseverança e o valor do trabalho árduo não reconhecido. Dick Diem and the Grey Seattle Morning painted the glass towers of the tech district in muted tones as Marcus Chen adjusted his worn backpack straps and walked through the revolving doors of Nexus Technologies. At 24, he looked even younger, his slight frame often lost in oversized hoodies that had become his unofficial uniform. The reception area buzzed with the familiar energy of a mid-sized software company, developers clutching coffee cups like lifelines, project managers frantically checking their phones, and the distant hum of servers working overtime. Marcus badged in at 7:15 a.m., a full hour before most of his colleagues would arrive. This early ritual had become sacred to him over the past 18 months, since joining Nexus as a junior back-end developer. The quiet office allowed him to think clearly, to dive deep into code without the constant interruptions that would plague the day ahead. His desk sat in the corner of the open-plan workspace, strategically positioned where he could observe the office dynamics while remaining largely unnoticed. The setup was sparse: 2 monitors, a mechanical keyboard that he'd bought with his first paycheck, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrived despite the fluorescent lighting. Around him, empty desks awaited their occupants, each workspace telling a story through personal artifacts: family photos, motivational quotes, expensive gadgets that served more as status symbols than tools. Marcus opened his laptop and immediately pulled up the code repository for the company's flagship product, Nexus Flow, a project management platform that served over 50,000 businesses worldwide. While his official role involved maintaining legacy systems and fixing minor bugs, Marcus had gradually begun exploring the platform's architecture during his early morning sessions. What he discovered both fascinated and troubled him. The system was held together by digital duct tape and prayers. Inefficient database queries caused slowdowns during peak hours. The user authentication system had security vulnerabilities that made him lose sleep. The mobile API was so poorly optimized that it consumed 3 times more server resources than necessary. These weren't glamorous problems that would earn recognition in team meetings, but they were the foundation upon which everything else was built. As the office began to fill around 8:30, Marcus minimized his exploration windows and opened his assigned ticket queue. The transformation was immediate, from focused innovator to invisible worker bee. His manager, Janet Walsh, swept past his desk with barely a glance, her attention focused on the senior developers who had just arrived with their usual morning ritual of discussing weekend adventures and debating the latest tech trends. "Morning team meeting in 10 minutes, Janet announced, her voice carrying across the floor. "We need to discuss the client retention numbers from last quarter." Marcus gathered his notebook and followed the migration towards the glass-walled conference room. The seating arrangement was always the same: senior developers at the table, project leads flanking Janet, and junior staff scattered around the periphery like satellites orbiting a distant star. Marcus found his usual spot against the back wall, close enough to hear, but far enough to remain invisible. "All right, people, we have a problem," Janet began, pulling up a presentation on the wall-mounted display. The charts painted a concerning picture. Client churn rates had increased by 15% over the past 6 months, and user engagement metrics were trending downward. Support tickets are up 40%, mostly complaints about system slowdowns and mobile app crashes. Around the table, the senior developers shifted uncomfortably. Brad Hoffman, the lead front-end developer, cleared his throat. "The mobile team has been working on optimization, but it's challenging with the current API structure." Sarah Kim, the senior back-end architect, nodded in agreement. "We've identified several bottlenecks, but addressing them would require significant refactoring. It's not something we can fix with a quick patch." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He had identified these exact issues months ago and had even begun developing potential solutions during his early morning sessions. His notebook contained detailed analysis of the database inefficiencies, proposed API optimizations, and a complete security audit of the authentication system. But as he looked around the room at the animated discussion, he felt the familiar weight of invisibility. "What about the back-end performance issues?" asked Tom Rodriguez, the project manager for their largest client. "Davidson Industries is threatening to cancel their contract if we don't resolve the timeout errors." "We're aware of the issue," Sarah replied, though her expression suggested she was less certain about the solution. "It appears to be related to some legacy database queries, but isolating the specific problems is proving difficult." Marcus's hand moved toward his notebook, where he had documented the exact queries causing the Davidson Industries timeouts. He had traced the issue to a poorly indexed table that was being called recursively during report generation. The fix would take maybe 2 hours to implement and test. But as he glanced around the room, seeing the intense expressions of his colleagues and the expectant look on Janet's face, his courage faltered. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes with various team members proposing solutions that Marcus knew wouldn't address the root causes. When Janet finally dismissed the group, the atmosphere was tense with unresolved problems and mounting pressure. Marcus walked back to his desk, his notebook feeling heavier with each step. The day proceeded with its usual rhythm of ignored contributions and overlooked insights. During the afternoon stand-up meeting, when Janet asked if anyone had ideas for improving system performance, Marcus raised his hand tentatively. "I've been looking at some of the database queries and I think I might have found—" "Thanks, Marcus," Janet interrupted with a polite smile. "But let's focus on immediate fixes for now. Sarah, what's the timeline on your optimization review?" As the conversation moved past him once again, Marcus felt the familiar sting of dismissal. It wasn't malicious. His colleagues weren't deliberately cruel. They simply didn't see him as someone capable of solving complex problems. To them, he was the quiet kid who fixed small bugs and maintained legacy code, not someone who could architect solutions to critical business problems. The Seattle rain had started by the time Marcus left the office at 6 p.m., most of his colleagues having departed hours earlier. As he walked to the bus stop, his reflection in the rain-streaked windows of passing storefronts looked smaller somehow, diminished by another day of being professionally invisible. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a different narrative was taking shape, one where his quiet observations and late-night innovations would finally matter. 3 weeks had passed since the tense meeting about client retention, and the problems at Nexus Technologies had only intensified. Marcus arrived at the office each morning to find the atmosphere growing more strained, with hushed conversations in hallways and worried glances exchanged between senior staff members. The Davidson Industries contract hung in the balance, and 2 other major clients had submitted formal complaints about system performance. The early morning quiet had become Marcus's sanctuary of productivity. While his colleagues slept, he worked on solutions that no one had asked for, but everyone desperately needed. His personal project folder had grown into a comprehensive overhaul of NexusFlow's core systems. Database optimizations that would reduce query times by 70%, API restructuring that would cut mobile response times in half, and security patches that would close vulnerabilities he'd discovered in the authentication system. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus implemented a temporary fix for the Davidson Industries timeout issue on his local development environment. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, restructuring 3 database queries and adding proper indexing to a table that had been overlooked during the platform's rapid scaling phase. He tested the fix multiple times, documenting the performance improvements with the methodical precision that had become his trademark. The sound of Janet's heels clicking across the office floor interrupted his concentration. She was arriving earlier than usual, her expression tense as she juggled phone calls with what appeared to be increasingly agitated clients. Marcus minimized his work and opened his assigned ticket queue, falling back into his role as the invisible maintenance worker. "Marcus!" Janet called out, surprising him. She rarely addressed him directly unless there was a specific bug to fix. I need you to pull all the error logs from the Davidson Industries account for the past week. Sarah's team needs them for their investigation." "Of course," Marcus replied, already knowing exactly which errors she was referring to. "Should I compile them into a specific format?" "Just the raw logs for now. They're trying to identify patterns." Janet paused, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You've been working on their account maintenance, right? Have you noticed anything unusual?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was an opening, a chance to share what he'd discovered. "Actually, I have noticed some patterns in the error logs. There are specific queries that seem to be causing cascading failures during peak usage hours. I've been tracking them, and I think I might have identified—" "Great, just get me those logs as soon as possible," Janet interrupted, already turning away to answer another phone call. "We're having an emergency meeting at 10 to discuss immediate solutions." The familiar disappointment settled in Marcus's chest as he watched Janet walk away, her attention already consumed by the next crisis. He pulled the requested logs, but also compiled his analysis of the error patterns, hoping that maybe this time someone would take a moment to review his findings. The emergency meeting convened in the main conference room with even more people than usual, crammed into the space. Representatives from the sales team had joined the technical staff, their nervous energy adding to the already tense atmosphere. Marcus positioned himself in his usual spot along the back wall, his folder of analysis held close to his chest. "The situation has escalated," Janet began without preamble. "Davidson Industries has given us 48 hours to demonstrate significant improvement in system performance, or they're terminating their contract. That's 12% of our annual revenue walking out the door." Brad Hoffman leaned forward, his usual confidence replaced by visible stress. "We've been working around the clock on front-end optimizations, but the real bottlenecks seem to be back-end related." Sarah Kim nodded grimly. "I've reviewed the error logs Marcus pulled, and the patterns are concerning. We're seeing cascade failures that originate from what appears to be inefficient database operations, but isolating the specific queries is proving difficult with our current monitoring tools." Marcus's folder seemed to burn in his hands. Every issue they were describing was documented in his analysis, along with proposed solutions. He had identified the exact queries causing the cascade failures, traced their origins through the system architecture, and developed fixes that would address not just the symptoms, but the underlying causes. "What about bringing in external consultants?" suggested Tom Rodriguez. "We could hire a database optimization firm to audit our systems." "That would take weeks and cost us 6 figures, Janet replied, rubbing her temples. "We need solutions now, not next month." The discussion continued for another hour, with various team members proposing increasingly desperate measures: emergency server scaling, temporary patches that would mask symptoms without addressing causes, even the suggestion of manually handling Davidson Industries reports to avoid the problematic automated processes entirely. Marcus watched his colleagues struggle with problems he had already solved, feeling like a doctor watching patients suffer from a disease while holding the cure in his hands. Every proposal they discussed would either fail to address the root issues or create new problems down the line. His solutions were comprehensive, tested, and ready for implementation, but they might as well have been written in invisible ink. As the meeting wound down with no concrete solutions, only assignments for further investigation, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to his desk to work on assigned tickets, he spent the rest of the day implementing his fixes on a staging server. Working with the focused intensity that came from months of preparation, he deployed his database optimizations, API improvements, and security patches to a complete mirror of the production environment. The results were extraordinary. Query response times dropped by an average of 68%. The timeout errors that had been plaguing Davidson Industries disappeared entirely. The mobile API, which had been consuming excessive server resources, now operated with remarkable efficiency. Even the user authentication system, with its newly patched vulnerabilities, performed faster than before. As the office emptied that evening, Marcus remained at his desk, documenting his results with screenshots, performance metrics, and detailed explanations of each improvement. The staging environment told a story of transformation, From a system held together by digital prayers to a robust, efficient platform that could handle twice the current user load without breaking a sweat. But as he prepared to leave, Marcus faced the same dilemma that had haunted him for months. How do you make people listen when they've grown accustomed to not hearing you? The solutions existed, proven and ready for deployment, but they lived in the shadow of his professional invisibility. Tomorrow's meeting would determine Davidson Industries' fate, and with it, the future of Nexus Technologies. Marcus gathered his documentation and headed into the Seattle evening, carrying with him both the weight of having answers no one would ask for and the growing conviction that somehow he had to find a way to make his voice heard. The morning of the Davidson Industries deadline arrived with an uncharacteristic silence that seemed to permeate every corner of Nexus Technologies. Marcus entered the office at his usual 7:15 a.m. to find several cars already in the parking lot, an unprecedented sight that spoke to the gravity of the situation. Through the glass doors, he could see Janet pacing in the conference room while speaking rapidly into her phone, her free hand gesturing emphatically at charts and graphs projected on the wall. Marcus settled at his desk and opened his laptop, but instead of diving into code, he found himself staring at the email draft he'd composed the night before. It contained everything: his complete analysis of the system failures, detailed documentation of his solutions, and proof of concept results from the staging environment. The email represented months of silent work and the potential end of his professional invisibility. His finger hovered over the send button, paralyzed by the familiar fear of being dismissed once again. The office began filling earlier than usual, with developers arriving clutching oversized coffee cups like talismans against the impending disaster. Conversations were muted, punctuated by nervous laughter and the constant ping of urgent messages. The weight of potential failure hung in the air like Seattle's persistent morning fog. At 9 a.m., Janet called an all-hands meeting. The main conference room couldn't accommodate everyone, so additional chairs were brought in, and some staff members stood along the walls. Marcus found himself pressed against the back corner, his laptop bag containing printed copies of his analysis feeling heavier with each passing minute. "I won't sugarcoat this," Janet began, her voice carrying the strain of sleepless nights. "Davidson Industries is conducting their final system test at 2 p.m. today. If we see the same performance issues, they're gone. And if Davidson walks, we can expect other clients to follow. This isn't just about one contract. It's about the future of this company." Sarah Kim stood to address the room, her usual composed demeanor cracked by obvious stress. "My team has been working through the night implementing what we hoped would be solutions. We've optimized front-end caching, increased server capacity, and restructured some of the more obvious database queries. But I have to be honest, we're still seeing intermittent timeout errors in our tests." A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Brad Hoffman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The mobile performance issues persist as well. We've managed to reduce loading times by about 15%, but it's not enough to meet the benchmarks Davidson requires." Marcus felt his chest tighten. The solutions to every problem they described were sitting in his laptop bag, tested and ready for implementation. His staging environment had eliminated the timeout errors entirely, improved mobile performance by over 50%, and addressed security vulnerabilities that hadn't even been discovered yet. But as he looked around the room at the faces of colleagues who had never truly seen him as an equal, the familiar paralysis set in. "What about external help?" asked Tom Rodriguez. "Can we bring in emergency contractors?" "At this point, there isn't time," Janet replied, checking her watch. "We have 5 hours before Davidson's test. Whatever solutions we implement need to be tested and stable by then." The meeting devolved into increasingly desperate brainstorming. Suggestions ranged from the technically sound to the borderline absurd: manually processing Davidson's reports, implementing rolling server restarts during peak usage, even the possibility of claiming a cyber attack to buy more time. Marcus listened to each proposal, knowing that they were like putting bandages on severed arteries. As the meeting broke up into smaller working groups, Marcus remained in his corner, watching his colleagues scatter to implement fixes that would likely fail. The familiar weight of being professionally invisible had become almost unbearable. He possessed the keys to the kingdom, but his hands were shaking too much to unlock the door. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. The office buzzed with the nervous energy of controlled panic as teams implemented their various solutions. Marcus was assigned to monitor system logs, appropriate work for someone considered incapable of architecting real solutions. But as he watched the error patterns that he knew would persist despite his colleagues' efforts, something inside him began to shift. At 12:30 p.m., with just 90 minutes until Davidson's test, Sarah Kim's voice carried across the office with barely controlled frustration. "We're still seeing cascade failures. The query optimizations helped, but we're missing something fundamental. Brad's team reported similar results. Mobile response times are better, but not where they need to be. We're running out of options." Marcus found himself standing up before he'd consciously decided to do so. His legs carried him towards the conference room where the senior team had gathered for emergency planning. Through the glass walls, he could see Janet with her head in her hands while Sarah frantically scribbled calculations on the whiteboard. He knocked on the door. "Not now, Marcus," Janet called out without looking up. "We're in crisis mode." But Marcus didn't leave. Instead, he opened the door and stepped inside. His laptop bag clutched against his chest like armor. The room fell silent as 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him, some annoyed, others simply surprised by his unprecedented interruption. "I know you're busy," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he'd expected, "but I think I might have something that could help." Sarah looked up from the whiteboard, her expression a mixture of desperation and skepticism. "Marcus, we appreciate the offer, but we need enterprise-level solutions, not bug fixes." "I understand," Marcus replied, opening his laptop and connecting it to the room's display system. "But what if I told you I've been running the Davidson Industries workload on a staging environment, and I've eliminated the timeout errors completely?" The room went completely silent. Janet's head came up from her hands, and Brad leaned forward in his chair. On the wall display, Marcus's staging environment metrics appeared, clean, green, and showing performance improvements that seemed almost too good to be true. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, studying the numbers. "These query response times. How did you—" Marcus took a deep breath, feeling 18 months of professional invisibility about to shatter like glass. "I've been working on this for months. Every morning before anyone arrives, every evening after everyone leaves. I know exactly what's wrong with our system, and I know how to fix it." The room erupted into questions, but Marcus was already pulling up his comprehensive analysis, ready to finally be seen. The conference room had transformed into a command center of focused intensity. Marcus's laptop remained connected to the wall display, showing performance metrics that defied everything the senior team thought they knew about their system's limitations. Janet had moved from her position at the head of the table to stand directly behind Marcus, her eyes scanning the data with the hunger of someone who had just discovered a lifeline. "Walk us through this step by step," Sarah Kim said, her earlier skepticism replaced by professional curiosity tinged with amazement. "These database query improvements, how did you identify the bottlenecks we missed?" Marcus's fingers moved across his keyboard with newfound confidence, pulling up detailed analysis charts that represented months of methodical investigation. "I started by tracking error patterns during peak usage hours. The cascade failures weren't random. They followed a specific sequence tied to how our reporting system queries the user activity table." He highlighted sections of code on the screen, his voice growing stronger as he explained the technical details. "The original queries were using nested select statements without proper indexing. During Davidson Industries' morning report generation, the system was essentially performing the same complex calculation thousands of times instead of caching the results." Brad Hoffman leaned forward, studying the code with the intensity of someone witnessing a magic trick being explained. "But we reviewed those queries months ago. How did we miss this?" "The issue only manifests under specific load conditions," Marcus explained, pulling up performance graphs that showed the problem's subtle evolution. "It started small when Davidson was using maybe 30% of their licensed user capacity. But as they scaled up to full usage, the inefficiency compounded exponentially." Tom Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the technical discussion, suddenly spoke up. "Wait, You're telling me you've been tracking Davidson's usage patterns individually? That level of analysis would require custom monitoring scripts that I wrote to isolate client-specific performance metrics. Marcus finished, displaying another screen of data. I set them up to run during off hours so they wouldn't impact production performance. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Marcus hadn't just stumbled upon solutions. He had conducted a comprehensive, months-long investigation that surpassed anything the senior team had attempted. Janet checked her watch. 1:15 p.m., 45 minutes until Davidson's test. Can we implement this? Janet asked, her voice carrying both hope and urgency. All of it. Marcus nodded, already opening his deployment scripts. Everything is tested and ready. The database optimizations can be applied in 15 minutes. The API improvements will take another 10. The security patches. He paused, realizing he was about to reveal the full extent of his unauthorized system exploration. The security patches address vulnerabilities that could have caused major problems down the line. Sarah's eyes widened. Security vulnerabilities? What kind of vulnerabilities? Authentication bypass possibilities, SQL injection vectors in the admin panel, and session management flaws that could have allowed unauthorized access to client data. Marcus replied matter-of-factly, as if discovering critical security holes was routine maintenance, rather than the kind of work that typically earned senior developer salaries. The room erupted into a controlled frenzy of activity. Janet immediately authorized Marcus to begin implementation, while Sarah coordinated with the infrastructure team to prepare for the changes. Brad's team stood ready to handle any front-end adjustments that might be needed. For the first time in his career at Nexus Technologies, Marcus found himself at the center of everyone's attention. As Marcus began deploying his solutions to the production environment, he walked the team through each change, explaining not just what he was doing, but why each modification was necessary. His quiet voice filled the room with technical details that demonstrated a depth of understanding that surprised even Sarah, who had been architecting back-end systems for over a decade. The mobile API optimization is particularly elegant, Sarah observed, watching Marcus implement real-time caching strategies that she hadn't considered. You've essentially created a predictive loading system that anticipates user behavior patterns. I analyzed 6 months of user interaction data to identify the most common workflow sequences, Marcus explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The API now preloads data for the next 3 most likely user actions, reducing perceived loading times by an average of 62%. At 1:50 p.m. with 10 minutes to spare, Marcus initiated the final system restart to activate all improvements. The office had gathered around the conference room with developers and project managers pressed against the glass walls to witness what had become an impromptu miracle. The production environment came back online with metrics that matched Marcus's staging results, clean, efficient, and performing at levels that exceeded even Davidson Industries' most optimistic requirements. At exactly 2 p.m., Davidson Industries began their final system test. The monitoring dashboard, now enhanced with Marcus's custom tracking tools, showed their usage in real time, where previous tests had shown cascading red alerts and timeout errors. The display remained steadfastly green. The first hour passed without incident. The second hour showed performance metrics that were actually better than the baseline requirements. By 4 p.m., when Davidson's technical team concluded their evaluation, the system had handled their peak load testing with resources to spare. Janet's phone rang at 4:30 p.m. The conversation was brief, professional, and concluded with her saying, "Thank you, Mr. Davidson. We're pleased the improvements meet your standards." She hung up and turned to face the room full of anxious colleagues. Davidson Industries is not only staying, they're expanding their contract by 40% and recommending us to 3 other companies in their network. The office erupted in celebration. But Janet raised her hand for quiet. She walked over to Marcus, who was still seated at his laptop, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of his professional fortune. "Ladies and gentlemen," Janet announced, her voice carrying across the entire office, "I want everyone to understand something. The system improvements that just saved our company, the innovations that turned our biggest crisis into our greatest success, none of this would exist without Marcus Chen. The applause was immediate and sustained. Colleagues who had overlooked him for 18 months were seeing him clearly for the first time. Sarah Kim approached his desk with an expression of professional respect that Marcus had never experienced. "We need to talk about your role here," she said quietly. "Your title, your responsibilities, your compensation, everything needs to change." As Marcus looked around the office at faces that now regarded him with recognition and respect, he realized that his long period of professional invisibility had finally ended. The quiet kid who fixed small bugs had become the architect of the company's future, and everyone could see him now.